Imagine your morning commute, but instead of the usual sounds, you hear explosions. The once familiar streets are now filled with chaos and fear. The air is thick with smoke and the ground shakes with every blast. This is not a scene from a movie, this is the harsh reality for millions of people. The normalcy of daily life has been shattered, replaced by a constant state of alertness and dread. Every corner, every building, every street holds a new danger. The simple act of going to work or school has become a perilous journey. That's what life has been like for millions of Ukrainians since February 24, 2022. On that fateful day, their world was turned upside down. The invasion by Russian forces brought an abrupt end to peace and stability. Families were torn apart, homes were destroyed, and the future became uncertain. The streets that once echoed with the sounds of laughter and daily hustle now resonate with the cries of the wounded and the roar of artillery. The impact of this conflict is felt in every aspect of life, from the economy to education, from healthcare to social structures. Russia attacked its neighbor Ukraine, starting a huge war. The invasion was swift and brutal, catching many off guard. Tanks rolled across borders and cities were bombarded. The international community watched in shock as the conflict escalated. Diplomatic efforts to resolve the situation were met with resistance, and the war continued to rage on. The geopolitical landscape was forever altered, and the repercussions of this aggression were felt far beyond the borders of Ukraine. The world was reminded of the fragility of peace and the devastating consequences of war. Families hid in bomb shelters, cities became empty, the once bustling urban centers turned into ghost towns. People sought refuge wherever they could, often in cramped and unsanitary conditions. The fear of air raids and missile strikes kept them underground for days, sometimes weeks. The psychological toll of living in constant fear cannot be overstated. Children were particularly affected, their innocence stolen by the horrors of war. The sense of community was both a source of strength and a reminder of what had been lost. The world watched as a country was attacked. News outlets around the globe provided continuous coverage, bringing the grim realities of the conflict into living rooms everywhere. International reactions varied, with some countries offering support and others remaining neutral. The global community was divided, but the images of suffering and resilience united people in their empathy for the Ukrainian plight. Social media became a powerful tool for spreading awareness and rallying support. The war in Ukraine was not just a regional conflict, it became a global issue, highlighting the interconnectedness of our world. We saw sad pictures, mothers running with their kids, old people leaving their homes, maybe forever. The exodus of refugees was one of the most heartbreaking aspects of the war. Families were forced to make the difficult decision to leave everything behind in search of safety. The journey was fraught with danger, and many faced uncertain futures in foreign lands. The resilience of these individuals in the face of such adversity was inspiring. But the emotional and physical scars of displacement would last a lifetime. The humanitarian crisis that ensued called for immediate and sustained international aid. This war has hurt so many people. It shows us how bad war can be. The destruction was widespread, affecting not just infrastructure but also the very fabric of society. Schools, hospitals, and homes were reduced to rubble. The environmental impact was also significant, with landscapes scarred by the relentless bombardment. The human cost was immeasurable, with countless lives lost and many more forever changed. The war served as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of conflict and the urgent need for peace and reconciliation. But even with all the destruction, Ukrainians showed they are strong. The spirit of resilience and determination was evident in every act of defiance and every effort to rebuild. Communities came together to support one another, demonstrating the power of solidarity in the face of adversity. Volunteers worked tirelessly to provide aid, and local businesses adapted to the new reality, finding ways to continue operating despite the challenges. The strength and courage of the Ukrainian people became a beacon of hope, inspiring others around the world to stand with them. People became heroes, bravely fighting to protect their homes. Ordinary citizens took up arms to defend their country, their bravery and sacrifice becoming legendary. Stories of heroism emerged from the conflict, highlighting the extraordinary courage of those who stood up against overwhelming odds. These acts of valor were not just limited to the battlefield, they were seen in everyday acts of kindness and support. The war brought out the best in many, showing that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can shine brightly. To understand this war, let's go back to 1991. This was a pivotal year in world history, marking the end of the Soviet Union, a superpower that had dominated Eastern Europe for decades. The collapse of the Soviet Union led to the emergence of 15 independent republics, one of which was Ukraine. For the first time in modern history, Ukraine had the opportunity to chart its own course as a sovereign nation. Ukraine became its own country, after being ruled by the Soviet Union for a long time. The moment was filled with both jubilation and uncertainty. The lowering of the Soviet flag and the raising of the Ukrainian flag symbolized a new beginning. Ukrainians celebrated their newfound independence with parades, cultural events, and a renewed sense of national pride. People felt hopeful, but also unsure. The transition from a Soviet republic to an independent nation was fraught with challenges. Economic instability, political turmoil, and the need to establish a new national identity were just a few of the hurdles that lay ahead. Yet, amidst the uncertainty, there was a palpable sense of hope and optimism. Ukrainians were eager to build a better future for themselves and their children. Ukraine was close to Russia, but had its own culture and wanted to make its own choices. The two countries shared a long and complex history, with deep cultural, linguistic, and familial ties. However, Ukraine was determined to assert its independence and develop its own unique identity. This desire for self-determination often put Ukraine at odds with its powerful neighbor to the east. When the Soviet Union ended, Russia, led by Vladimir Putin, wanted to be powerful again. Putin, who rose to power in the late 1990s, was determined to restore Russia's influence on the global stage. He viewed the dissolution of the Soviet Union as a geopolitical catastrophe and sought to reassert Russian dominance in the post-Soviet space. This ambition often brought Russia into conflict with its former Soviet republics, including Ukraine. Things were tense for years. The relationship between Ukraine and Russia was marked by periods of cooperation and conflict. Border tensions, political disputes, and economic pressures created a volatile environment. Protests erupted in Ukraine, reflecting the deep divisions within the country over its future direction. The presence of Russian military forces near the border only heightened the sense of unease. Then in 2014, Russia took Crimea, part of Ukraine where many people speak Russian. The annexation of Crimea was a bold and controversial move. Russia justified its actions by citing the need to protect the rights of Russian-speaking citizens in Crimea. However, the international community widely condemned the annexation as a violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Other countries said this was wrong, but Russia didn't listen. The annexation of Crimea led to widespread international condemnation and the imposition of economic sanctions on Russia. World leaders, including those from the United States and the European Union, called for Russia to reverse its actions. Despite the outcry, Russia remained defiant, insisting that the annexation was both legal and justified. Taking Crimea showed that Putin was willing to use force to get what he wanted. The events of 2014 demonstrated Putin's willingness to challenge the international order and use military force to achieve his strategic objectives. The annexation of Crimea was not just about territorial gain. It was a clear signal to the world that Russia was prepared to assert its power and influence, regardless of the consequences. At the end of 2021, the world watched with growing concern as Russia began amassing a significant number of soldiers and military equipment along Ukraine's border. This buildup was not just a show of force, it was a clear signal that something ominous was on the horizon. The international community held its breath, hoping that diplomacy would prevail and that the situation would de-escalate. Despite numerous diplomatic efforts and high-stakes negotiations, the tension only seemed to escalate. World leaders engaged in frantic talks, trying to dissuade Russian President Vladimir Putin from taking aggressive action. However, Putin appeared resolute, his intentions seemingly set on a path of confrontation. The world watched as the diplomatic channels began to falter, and the threat of war loomed ever larger. On February 24, 2022, the worst fears were realized. In a coordinated and multifaceted assault, Russian forces launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The attack came from multiple directions, catching many off guard and plunging the region into chaos. The sound of explosions and the sight of tanks rolling across the border marked the beginning of a new and terrifying chapter in the conflict. In a public address, Putin justified the invasion by claiming that Ukraine was under the control of dangerous elements that needed to be removed. he painted a picture of a nation in turmoil, supposedly in need of liberation. However, these claims were widely disputed and seen as a pretext for an unprovoked act of aggression. Protests erupted globally, condemning Putin's actions and calling for an immediate end to the violence. The initial phase of the invasion was marked by rapid and violent clashes. Russian forces moved swiftly, employing overwhelming firepower to achieve their objectives. Cities and towns across Ukraine found themselves under siege, with the civilian population caught in the crossfire. The speed and ferocity of the attack left many in shock and disbelief. As the conflict intensified, Russian forces began targeting critical infrastructure. Bombs rained down on cities, causing widespread destruction. Hospitals, schools, and residential areas were not spared, leading to a humanitarian crisis. The images of bombed-out buildings and devastated communities highlighted the brutal reality of the war. Major cities like Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Mariupol became epicenters of intense fighting. These urban battlegrounds saw some of the most ferocious combat, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. The struggle for control of these key locations became symbolic of the broader conflict, representing the resilience and determination of the Ukrainian people. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, the Ukrainian forces mounted a formidable defense. Soldiers, volunteers, and ordinary citizens took up arms to protect their homeland. Their courage and tenacity became a rallying point, inspiring others to join the fight and resist the invasion. The international community responded with a wave of support for Ukraine. Military aid, humanitarian assistance, and diplomatic backing poured in from around the world. This support played a crucial role in bolstering Ukraine's defenses and slowing the Russian advance. The solidarity shown by other nations underscored the global condemnation of Russia's actions and the commitment to upholding international law and human rights. The war forced millions of Ukrainians, mostly women and kids, to leave their homes. They went to nearby countries like Poland, Romania, and Moldova. We saw pictures of tired families with only the clothes they were wearing. Inside Ukraine, things were even worse. Cities like Mariupol were destroyed, thousands of people died. The war also hurt Ukraine's economy. Schools, hospitals, and businesses were ruined. The world reacted quickly to Russia's attack. The United States, European countries, and other allies punished Russia by stopping trade and making it hard for them to do business. They wanted to hurt Russia's economy and make Putin stop. Many countries helped Ukraine by sending food, supplies, money, and weapons. The war showed problems in the world and how important it is for countries to work together. The war in Ukraine is still going on. Russia couldn't take Kiev, so they started fighting in the Donbas region in the east, where they have supported separatist groups since 2014. The fighting there is very bad, but there is some hope. Ukraine has taken back some land and there have been talks about peace, but it's not clear when the war will end. Putin doesn't seem ready to stop, and Ukraine wants to keep fighting for its freedom. The war is affecting everyone. It's harder to get things like oil and food, and prices have gone up. The war has also made problems between countries worse, and some people worry a bigger war could start. The possibility of nuclear weapons being used is scary. The war shows how connected the world is and how important it is for countries to follow the rules and work together. It also reminds us that peace is important and we need to protect it. Even with all the bad things happening, Ukrainians are strong. They haven't given up. Soldiers and regular people are working together to protect their country. The war is very sad, but it shows how strong people can be. Ukrainians are inspiring everyone. The war in Ukraine is a problem for the whole world. It's a fight between good and bad, between freedom and not having freedom. We need to help Ukraine. We can help groups that are giving food and supplies, tell our leaders to stop Russia, and learn about what's happening. The war shows us that peace is important and we need to work hard to keep it. Let's support Ukraine and work together for a better world.